Today's lecture is on adjectives and participles. As you can see, there are a few more points to address, but all of these points will be related. First up is subject pronouns. A pronoun is something that refers to a noun. In English, we have three sets of pronouns: subject, object, and possessive. What do I mean by that? Let's look at some examples. Subject pronoun, I jumped on the bed. Object, the monkey jumped on me. Possessive, my monkey jumped on the bed. All of these pronouns refer to me, the one who is speaking, but in each sentence, I take on a different role when I refer to myself. In the first one, I am the subject of the verb. In the second one, I'm now the object of the verb, the one who got jumped on. And in the third one, I'm neither the subject or object of the verb. The monkey is the subject, the bed is the object. My just says that the monkey belongs to me. In this lecture, we're only looking at subject pronouns in Hebrew, and we're only looking at the singular subject pronouns. Notice that Hebrew has pronouns for first person, second person when you talk to somebody directly, third person when you talk about somebody. And Hebrew distinguishes between gender, masculine and feminine in the second person, masculine and feminine in the third person. But for first person, you say ani or anochi, whether you're a guy or a girl. Notice that there are two forms. They mean the same thing. They're morphologically related. You have a shorter form, ani, a longer form, anochi, but it's not the case that the longer form is more emphatic. It's more subjective, where a speaker would prefer to use one over the other just because it sounded better to them, and possibly even in certain contexts. There's no clear distinction when someone would use one form over the other. But when you do second person, if you're talking to a guy, you say ata. If you're talking to a girl, you say at. If you're talking about a guy, you say who. If you're talking about a girl, you say he. Notice in the English glosses, we have it for both the feminine and also for the masculine. This is because Hebrew doesn't have a neuter gender. Every noun is masculine or feminine, and so these pronouns are also masculine or feminine, and you would use one depending on what you're referring to. If you're referring to a masculine object like kiseh, you would say hu. If you're referring to a feminine object like cherev, a sword, you would say he. And when you use one of these pronouns, it's always the subject of the clause that you're using. It's always the subject of the statement you're making. Next is adjectives. Unlike last section on pronouns where a pronoun refers to a noun, here an adjective describes a noun. When an adjective describes a noun, it can take one of three different functions. You can have an attributive, the good book, a predicate, the book is good, a substantive, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what's going on here? In attributive, you're not making a statement, you're just referring to the book, but in doing so, you're attributing some quality to the book, the good book. In predicate, you're actually making a statement. The book is good. Third, the adjective is actually taking the place of a noun. So, what is good? What is bad? And what is ugly? You would need context to know. Now, here we're just looking at Hebrew attributive adjectives, and we're only looking at singular adjectives. Adjectives inflect for gender. You can have a masculine adjective or a feminine adjective, and they inflect for number, singular and plural, but we're not looking at plural adjectives, just singular. As an example, a masculine singular adjective would be gadol, big. Feminine singular gedola. Now, looking at how you make these, this is just like last week where you inflect by adding something on the end, like we saw with imperatives and with nouns. So too with adjectives. The masculine singular adjective has no distinct ending, but feminine singular adjectives always end in comets he. This is like last week, where nouns the masculine singular doesn't have a distinct ending. Feminine singular, the most common ending is comets he, but we saw that nouns are actually really irregular to predict whether the noun is masculine or feminine by looking at the ending. For adjectives, it's totally 100% regular. If there's no distinct ending on the adjective, it's always masculine singular. If that adjective ends in comets he, it's always feminine singular. And all feminine singular adjectives end in comets he. Let's look at some examples. Notice there's this mnemonic, but before I describe it, let me give some examples. So if you're referring to a big horse, you would say sus gadol. It's an indefinite noun. You're just referring to a horse. So sus does not have the article. So too with the adjective. The attributive adjective always occurs after the noun, and the article always agrees. So if the noun doesn't have the article, neither will the adjective. And this is distinct from saying the big horse. In that case, you would have ha sus, ha gadol. And with number 3, notice that the adjective always agrees with the gender of the noun. Even if that's an irregular noun, like cherev, it doesn't look particularly feminine, but it is, and so you'd use the feminine singular adjective gedolah. A big horse, a big sword is cherev gedolah. Prepositions. A preposition describes the relationship between two different things in a sentence, and there are lots of different kinds of relationships that a preposition can express. For example, here, on describes the location relationship for where the sword is with respect to the table. Toward here describes the direction relationship for where Judah is walking. With here describes the means relationship for how Moses eats pancakes. Please note that these are not sentences taken from the Bible. Here, after describes the time relationship for when Sarah drinks coffee. And finally, to here describes the possession relationship for who owns the book. In English, there are lots of different prepositions, and pretty much each preposition has one function and describes one kind of relationship. In Hebrew, there are fewer prepositions. These are the prepositions that you've encountered so far. And pretty much each preposition has a second or a third function, but we illustrated illustrated one function, the location function. So for all, the dot is on the circle, tachat, the dot is under the circle, and la, the dot is going toward the circle. But for each of these, they can take on a different function. In some contexts, all can mean against or concerning. Tachat can mean instead of, and la can mark the possessor. Now, all of this information is in your English companion. So when you're learning the prepositions, take note of that in the English companion, but we don't expect you to memorize it. We expect you to memorize the location sense because we think that's the most basic, and the logical extension uses you can encounter in context. And so you can start off with the simplified system, and as you grow in your knowledge of Hebrew, your knowledge of the prepositions can likewise grow. And we'll always point out an extensional use of a preposition when you encounter it in a text. You're going to get all of these senses of the prepositions as you read text with us this year. One final thing, so we always illustrate the location sense of the prepositions, and there's a master key for the prepositions. I think it's card 418, and that notes all of the location prepositions on one card. So you have one circle and then lots of dots with respect to the circle for all the different location prepositions. A good thing to be aware of. Verbless clauses. In English, every clause has a verb, even if that verb doesn't mean anything, like the to be verb. Here are the three forms of the to be verb in the present tense. 4, I am hungry. 5, you are a Hebrew student. 6, the book is on the table. Hebrew doesn't have a to be verb in the present tense, and so it'll make equivalent statements without the use of a verb whatsoever. For example, number 7, the horse is big. You would say, Hasus gadol. Here, the noun has the article, while the adjective does not. This is an example of a predicate adjective when you're making a statement. Remember at 3 functions of an adjective: attributive, predicate, substantival. We're not doing substantive adjectives today. We already did attributive. This is predicate. The telltale sign of a predicate adjective is that the adjective lacks the article. We can compare this to the attributive adjective that we saw before. If you're not making a statement as in to, you're just saying the big horse. You have the article on both the noun and the adjective. Hasus hagadol. Remember the acrostic for attributive? The adjective is after the noun and the article agrees. The noun has the article, so the adjective must have the article. Whereas the predicate, there's a mismatch in definiteness. Now we also saw number 1, which is technically ambiguous. You need context to know whether or not someone is making a statement. This satisfies the criteria for attributive adjective because the adjective is after the noun and the article agrees, and that there's no article at all. And it satisfies the criteria for predicate because the adjective is indefinite. Now I said context will determine. Turns out, for the most part, any time where it's an indefinite noun and adjective, this is going to be attributive. Because whenever someone is making a statement about something, typically they're going to have a particular something in mind. Like, what is the context that someone would ever say, a horse is big? So pretty much whenever you encounter a predicate adjective, it'll look like number 7, where the noun is definite and the adjective is indefinite. If both the adjective and noun agree in definiteness, it's not making a statement, for the most part. Now, that's not the only kind of verbless clause. We have another example here in 8. I am a teacher, ani, which is one of those subject pronouns, more. Now, what happens if you're not equating a pronoun and a noun like you are in number 8, but 2 nouns? Well, you get something here where actually you get a subject pronoun stuck in between the 2 nouns, and this pronoun agrees in gender and number with the subject. So because Miriam is a feminine singular noun, you use the feminine singular adjective. Literally, this would read, Miriam, she is a teacher. But this isn't any kind of emphatic way to make a statement. This is just a typical way of equating 2 nouns. And notice in 10, David, a masculine singular, and so you get not he, but who. David hu talmid, to say David is a teacher. Now, noting this use of the pronoun is important because if you lack it, now this becomes ambiguous, and then context has to determine, is David talmid saying David, a student, and you're waiting for more information about who this David is or what he did, or it could possibly mean David is a student. So when you're equating 2 nouns, you don't need this subject pronoun in between, but when you do have the subject pronoun in between, then you're for sure making a statement. And now participles. A participle is a verbal adjective in that it means something like a verb, but it occurs in a place in a sentence just like an adjective. In English, participles are the ing verbs: running, jumping, skipping, dancing, etc. As a verbal adjective, participles have the same three functions as adjectives. So the attributive function, when it describes a noun: I have not met half of my living relatives. Predicate, when you're making a statement: her sister is living in Alaska. And substantive, when it's taking the place of a noun: why do you seek the dead among the living? Here are the participle endings. Participles, just like adjectives, inflect for two things: gender, masculine or feminine, and number, singular and plural. We're only looking at singular participles today. And you use a participle form depending on who you're referring to. How can you tell? Well, participles have these suffixes just like adjectives. For a masculine singular participle, there's no distinct suffix. But for a feminine singular participle, they end in either one of three suffixes: a, et, or ot. They're not irregular like verbs where a participle can look masculine but actually be feminine. The masculine participles always look like this. The feminine participles always look like this. There's slightly more variety for the participles than adjectives, but there's only three possible endings for feminine. Let's look at some examples of words that we've used in class. Drinking, if you're referring to a guy: shote, a gal, shota. Jumping, a guy, meka pets, a gal, meka petsit. Throwing, a guy, mashlich, a gal, mashlechet. Walking around, a guy, mithalech, a gal, mithalechet. Taking, a guy, lokeach, a gal, lokachat. Let's look at some examples using participles. Now, participles inflect for gender and number, but not person. So when you're using a participle, as long as you're referring to one guy, you can use the same form whether you're talking in the first person, second person, or third person. So first person, ani yoshev; second person, ata yoshev; third person, hu yoshev. And this works the same way in feminine. As long as you're referring to one gal, first person, ani yoshevet; second person, at yoshevet; third person, he yoshevet. So now in class, we've used two different verbal forms. You've been introduced to imperatives, giving commands, and participles, describing what a person is doing as they're doing it. So this corresponds to the English present tense, as you can see in the glosses. Note that neither the imperative or the participle are the two verbal forms that we have you memorize on the back of the cards, but both of these forms can be derived from one of those two forms that we do have you memorize. In the future, we'll tell you how you can derive them. But you should know that the phrase on the back of a verb that describes what's happening in the front of the card uses the participle form, because it's describing that in-progress action that we're depicting on the front of the card. And finally, the interrogative, which is just a fancy word for asking a question. In English, how do you ask a yes or a no question? Well, you take a statement like, Moses is sitting. And then you take this helping verb is, you move it to the front, and there's your question. Is Moses sitting? Hebrew is going to form yes or no questions quite similarly. Something is going to appear at the beginning of the question, but it's not going to be from movement. It's going to be a prefix, huh. It attaches to the first word of a question to mark a yes or a no question. Now, sometimes, depending on what word it attaches to, it will appear not as a chatef patach, but as a patach. And in these cases, it may look just like the article. And in these cases, context will inform you whether or not someone is asking a question. Now, notice with these two forms of basically the same question, appears at the beginning, but it's going to begin with a different word. What will happen is that will attach to the first word of the sentence, and that word is the true focus of the question. Say, for instance, that you know that someone is sitting, but you're not sure who. You may ask, Moshe Yoshev? Or you know that Moses is doing something, but you're not exactly sure what. You may ask, Yoshev Moshe? And in this way, Hebrew is able to do with word order what English has to do with vocal inflection. So we would ask this one something like, is Moses sitting? And this one, is Moses sitting? And there you go. That's the end of today's lecture. For more resources on internalizing the language of Scripture, please go to www.picturehebrew.com.